A quiet drifter limped into Rattlesnake Junction, carrying nothing but a battered Bible and haunted eyes. What the town's vicious outlaws didn't realize was that they were about to cross paths with Lightning Jack Hamilton, a man whose hands had drawn faster than human eyes could follow in 3 territories, a man who hadn't needed to kill in 7 years, until today. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The relentless Arizona sun beat down on Rattlesnake Junction's weathered boardwalks as Thomas Jack Hamilton adjusted the worn leather Bible tucked beneath his arm. The frontier town's buildings rose from the desert like broken teeth, their sun-bleached facades telling stories of dreams ground to dust by the merciless Southwest. He'd chosen this place precisely because it was dying. Fewer people meant fewer chances of someone recognizing the face that had once graced wanted posters across 3 territories. A hot wind stirred the dust along Main Street, carrying the acrid scent of creosote and desperate hopes. Hamilton's slight limp, earned not from gunfights but from months of hard riding, drew curious glances from the few townspeople brave enough to venture out in the midday heat. His appearance was carefully crafted, threadbare coat despite the heat, graying beard hiding most of his face, and most importantly, no gun belt. 7 years had passed since he'd worn steel on his hip, 7 years of seeking redemption through prayer instead of powder. The Last Chance Saloon's batwing doors crashed open, disgorging 4 men, whose very posture spoke of casual violence. Hamilton noticed their gun belts first, worn high and tight, the way men who lived by their weapons preferred. The tallest, sporting an elaborate silver-handled Colt and a face lined with old scars, couldn't have been more than 30. "Well, look what the wind dragged in, boys," the tall man drawled, his words carrying the artificial courage of cheap whiskey. "I ain't seen you dragging that leg around here before, old-timer." Hamilton kept walking, each step measured and deliberate. Experience had taught him that trouble, like a rattler, often announced itself before striking. His fingers unconsciously traced the Bible's worn cover, feeling the familiar brass crucifix inlaid there. 7 years of peace, 7 years of choosing a different path. "Ezra," a woman's voice cracked across the street like a whip. "What did your pa teach you about respecting your elders?" Rebecca Stone stood in the doorway of the general store, her dark hair streaked with desert-bleached strands, her posture speaking of someone used to being heeded. The 4 men straightened immediately, their drunken swagger replaced by something approaching shame. "Just making conversation, Miss Rebecca," Ezra mumbled, though he took a step back. "My apologies, sir," Rebecca said, her smile genuine but cautious. "Rattlesnake Junction can be unwelcoming to strangers, but we're working on our manners." She studied Hamilton's Bible and his absence of weapons. "Are you a preacher?" "We haven't had one since." "Just a traveler studying the good book," Hamilton replied, touching the brim of his battered hat. The lie wasn't complete. He did study the scripture, seeking answers for the lives his hands had taken before he'd found a different way. "Shame," Rebecca responded. "Well, if you change your mind about staying, the store's always open for honest folk." She turned to the men. "Ezra, you and your boys sober up. Your father wants to see you at the ranch before sundown." Hamilton continued down the street, aware of the eyes following him. He'd learned long ago to read a town's pulse within the first hour, and Rattlesnake Junction's was racing like a fevered heart. The tension in the air reminded him of moments before a gunfight, when the world held its breath, waiting for the first shot. He found the undertaker's office near the end of Main Street, the weathered sign reading, "Clayton's Final Rest," swaying in the hot breeze. A small bell announced his entrance, and Thomas Clayton looked up from his ledger, the undertaker's eyes widening slightly at Hamilton's appearance before composing himself. "Welcome, brother," Clayton said, his voice carrying the practiced solemnity of his profession. "What brings a man of the book to my humble establishment?" Coffee and information, Hamilton replied, placing a worn coin on the counter. If you're willing to sell both. Clayton hesitated, glancing at the closed door. Information comes dear in Rattlesnake Junction, especially about certain people. The Stone family. Stone? Hamilton's voice remained neutral, though the name stirred something in his memory, something from his past life, when his hands dealt lead instead of blessings. Jeremiah Stone and his boys, Clayton chose his words carefully, came here 3 years ago when the silver strike proved smaller than hoped. Most folks had already left, but they saw opportunity in others' misfortune. The bell rang again, and Dr. Sarah Chen entered, her medical bag clutched tight. The young woman nodded to Hamilton before addressing Clayton. Those supplies come in yet? Got patients needing care up at the mine. Tomorrow's stage, Doc, Clayton replied, glancing meaningfully at Hamilton. Our traveling friend was just leaving. Hamilton took the hint and headed for the door, but Dr. Chen's voice stopped him. Hold on. Her dark eyes narrowed, studying his face. Have we met before? Something about you seems... Don't believe so, Hamilton replied, though he recognized her from a field hospital outside Atlanta. She'd been there the day he'd made a choice that set him on his current path. Must be thinking of someone else, Chen muttered. Though I never forget a face, especially one with such... Hamilton was through the door before she could finish. The sun had begun its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. He needed to find lodging for the night and move on before anyone else started remembering faces from the war. But fate, he was learning, had other plans for Rattlesnake Junction. A shrill whistle pierced the evening air. Ezra Stone and his 3 companions had positioned themselves at strategic points along the street, their earlier drunken demeanor replaced by cold calculation. Jeremiah Stone emerged from between 2 buildings, a Winchester rifle held with casual familiarity in his weathered hands. You know, Stone called out, his earlier friendliness absent, in this town, we take particular interest in strangers who aren't what they seem, friend. Or should I say, Lightning Jack? Hamilton stopped, the old name striking him like a physical blow. It had been 7 years since anyone had spoken it aloud, 7 years since he'd walked away from the reputation built one split-second draw at a time. He'd buried that life in a shallow grave outside Santa Fe, or so he'd thought. Dr. Chen has an excellent memory for faces, Stone continued, working the rifle's lever with deliberate precision. Particularly those she patched up after famous gunfights. The question is, what brings the legendary Lightning Jack to my quiet little town, carrying scripture instead of steel? Hamilton turned slowly, keeping his hands visible and well away from his sides. The habit, ingrained by years of gunfighting, had never quite left him, even after trading his Colts for the good book. Like I said before, just passing through. Stone's laugh was sharp as broken glass. Nobody just passes through Rattlesnake Junction anymore. Marcus, Hank, escort our guest somewhere more private. We need to have a longer conversation about his intentions. The 2 men advanced, confidence born of youth and inexperience with real killers. They clearly expected another tired drifter, maybe an aging gunman living on faded glory. What they couldn't know was that Thomas Lightning Jack Hamilton hadn't earned his name from slow hands, and 7 years of peace hadn't changed the speed that had once made him a legend from Texas to the territories. As Marcus and Hank approached from both sides, Hamilton's mind catalogued details with the precision that had kept him alive through 100 gunfights. Marcus's slight favor of his right leg, Hank's telltale tension in his gun hand, the way young Ezra's fingers drummed nervously on his silver-handled Colt. Gentlemen, Hamilton said quietly, I suggest you reconsider. Stone laughed, a sound like stones in a grinder. Or what, old man? You'll quote scripture at us? Where's your famous speed now, Lightning Jack? Even the Bible says there's a time for war. It also says, "Blessed are the peacemakers," Hamilton replied. "Haven't carried guns in 7 years." This gave them pause, Stone's rifle shifting slightly as confusion crossed his face. 7 years. The man who once drew faster than a rattler's strike, who outgunned the delayed brothers in El Paso. That takes some believing. Why? Stone's question carried genuine curiosity. Hamilton's hand unconsciously touched the Bible's brass crucifix. "Because every bullet finds its mark eventually, and I got tired of watching where they landed, tired of sending souls to judgment before their time." "Touching story," Marcus growled, taking another step forward. "But in times like these, a man needs steel to back up his words, not fairy tales about redemption." "I made a promise," Hamilton said, his voice carrying the weight of years. "No more killing, no more guns, no more watching good men die for causes they barely understand." Stone's laugh was sharp. "Noble sentiments, but this isn't your glory days anymore, Lightning Jack. This is my town." "That's where you're wrong, Mr. Stone." Hamilton's eyes met his. "Every town becomes a battlefield when men like you decide who lives and who dies. I've seen enough of that to last 10 lifetimes. "Marcus," Stone commanded, "teach our principled friend about the realities of Rattlesnake Junction." The big man lunged, meaty fists swinging in a combination that had dropped many men before. But Hamilton wasn't there anymore. He moved like morning mist, redirecting Marcus's momentum into empty air. The larger man stumbled, confusion replacing confidence. "I won't kill," Hamilton said, stepping away from a wild swing, "but I won't die either." Hank drew his knife, the blade catching the last rays of sunlight. "Let's see how peaceful you are with 8 inches of steel in your gut." The knife darted out, quick as a striking snake, but Hamilton caught the man's wrist. A simple twist, learned in a mining camp prayer meeting from a Chinese missionary, and the blade clattered to the dirt. Hank howled, cradling his numb arm. "Enough!" Stone's rifle cracked, sending a bullet into the dirt at Hamilton's feet. "Very impressive, Lightning Jack. Your hands are still quick, Bible or no Bible. But Scripture doesn't stop bullets." "No," Hamilton agreed, "it doesn't. But it gives a man something worth dying for." He turned to face Stone fully. "You want to know why I'm here? Truth is, I was looking for a quiet place to rest, somewhere to forget about the speed and the glory and all the things men do in the name of power." His eyes swept the gathering crowd of townspeople. "And now I'm wondering why a man smart enough to run a town needs boys like these to do his thinking for him." Ezra, who had been watching wide-eyed, spoke up. "Pa's protecting us. The mining companies would have taken everything if he hadn't." "Quiet, boy," Stone snapped, but Hamilton caught the flash of something in his eyes. "Pride? Shame? Protection," Hamilton said softly. "That's what every tyrant promises, but I've noticed it's usually the protectors who end up with the spoils." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus had recovered his balance, face red with rage and embarrassment. "Let me kill him, Pa. Man's got a mouth on him." Stone's response surprised them all. "Lightning Jack is right about one thing. I do my own thinking." He lowered the rifle slightly. "You've made your point about non-violence, Jack. Very noble. But Rattlesnake Junction isn't a philosophy debate. We have real problems here." "I've seen your real problems," Hamilton replied, gesturing at the town around them. "Scared shopkeepers, a doctor who remembers too much about a war everybody else wants to forget, young men playing at being gunfighters. Seems to me the only real problem is the man holding the rifle." Stone's smile was razor-thin. "You've been here less than an hour. Don't presume to understand what's at stake." "I understand that fear only works until someone stops being afraid." Hamilton looked at Ezra. "Or until someone young enough to believe in heroes decides to become one." The evening wind carried the sound of distant thunder, though no clouds marred the darkening sky. Dr. Chen, who had watched the confrontation from her clinic's doorway, cleared her throat. "I remember you now, completely. After that business in Atlanta, you spent 3 days helping me tend the wounded, both sides, never asked which was which. A man's choice of uniform doesn't tell you the weight of his soul," Hamilton said. "I learned that the hard way." Stone's rifle hadn't moved, but something in his stance had changed. "Pretty words, but words don't feed people or keep the mining companies from squeezing us dry." "No," Hamilton agreed, "but they might remind folks that there are choices beyond the bullet or the boot heel." He turned his back on Stone's rifle, facing the setting sun. "You won't shoot me, Mr. Stone, because then you'd have to admit you're exactly what they say you are. Just another vulture feeding on what's left of other people's dreams." The silence stretched like a drawn bowstring. Finally, Stone laughed, but this time it held less edge. "All right, Lightning Jack, you've earned yourself 1 night of peace, but come sunrise, I expect you to be gone from my town." "Your town?" Hamilton glanced over his shoulder at the faces watching from windows and doorways. "Might want to ask them about that. Seems to me they've got some opinions on the matter." He walked away, leaving Stone with his rifle and his thoughts. As he passed Chen, the doctor muttered, "The boarding house has a back room. Owner owes me a favor." Hamilton nodded slightly. He'd meant what he said about leaving, but sunrise was still hours away, and sometimes, he reflected, the most important battles were won without firing a shot. Behind him, he heard Stone ordering his men back to their posts, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. Seeds of doubt, Hamilton knew, could grow into forests of change. He just had to survive long enough to see what kind of forest Rattlesnake Junction would become. The boarding house's parlor was empty, save for Rebecca Stone, who sat by the window cleaning an old revolver. She looked up as Hamilton entered, her hands never stopping their practiced motion. "Figured you'd end up here," she said quietly. "Sarah. Dr. Chen. She always did have a soft spot for strays." "Your father know you're here?" Hamilton asked, noting how she held the gun with familiar ease. "Jeremiah Stone's not my father. He married my mother after my real pa died in the mine collapse. Claimed he was protecting us." Her laugh held no humor. "Didn't mention the protection would cost us everything we had." Hamilton sat in a worn armchair, his Bible resting in his lap. "Yet you still work at his store." "Keep your friends close," Rebecca replied, "and your stepfather closer. Someone needs to know what he's planning." She reassembled the revolver with swift precision. "He's afraid of you, you know. Not your speed. He's dealt with fast guns before. He's afraid you'll make people remember who they were before fear became their daily bread." And who were they? Miners, ranchers, shopkeepers, people who helped each other instead of looking over their shoulders. Before the mine played out, before the mining companies started circling like vultures, before Jeremiah Stone offered his special brand of protection, Hamilton studied her face, seeing echoes of the young girl she must have been before life taught her to clean guns in secret. What changed? Everything. Nothing. She sighed. The silver ran out, but that wasn't what killed Rattlesnake Junction. It was the vultures who came after, offering to buy claims for pennies, threatening those who wouldn't sell. Stone promised to keep them away, didn't mention his price would be just as steep. And the mining companies? Still circle, still wanting what's left. Stone keeps them at bay, but each protection payment gets heavier. Each month more folks leave. Those who stay... She gestured at the empty street outside. "They're either too scared to leave or too stubborn to quit, or too young to know better," Hamilton added, thinking of Ezra's nervous finger-tapping. Rebecca's hands stilled on the revolver. "My stepbrother's not evil, just young, trying to be what his father wants. Sometimes I think that's more dangerous than real evil." A good heart turned wrong by bad teaching. A floorboard creaked, and they both turned to see Dr. Chen in the doorway, her medical bag clutched tight. "Got a problem," she said without preamble. Mining company men were seen on the North Road, full crew, with papers from the territorial court. "How long?" Rebecca asked, sliding the revolver into her skirt pocket. "Dawn, maybe sooner. Stone's calling a town meeting at the saloon." Chen's eyes met Hamilton's. "Might be interesting to hear what a man who gave up his guns has to say about that." Hamilton touched the brass crucifix on his Bible. 7 years of peace, 7 years of choosing a different path. But sometimes, he reflected, the hardest choice wasn't between peace and violence. It was between walking away and standing firm. "Interesting," he said finally. "Isn't the word I'd choose." The Last Chance Saloon had never seen such a crowd. Lamplight cast dancing shadows on worried faces as Hamilton stood near the back, watching Stone command attention from his position at the bar. The room smelled of tobacco, fear, and spilled whiskey, a combination Hamilton had known too well in his previous life. "Mining company claims they've got new papers," Stone announced, his voice carrying to every corner. "Says the territorial court's given them rights to all unclaimed water sources in the county." His eyes swept the crowd, including our well. The explosion of voices was immediate. Hamilton watched reactions, reading the room like he once read opponents' tells. Rebecca stood beside her stepfather, her face carefully neutral, though her hand never strayed far from her hidden revolver. Dr. Chen leaned against the far wall, exhaustion evident in her stance, but her dark eyes alert, missing nothing. "They can't do that!" Morton Walsh, the blacksmith, slammed his massive fist on a table. "That well's been here since before the town was built." Stone raised his hands for quiet. "Territory says they can, unless—" He paused, letting tension build. "Unless we can prove prior claim. Show we've been working the land continuous, keeping up improvements." "Which we haven't," Rebecca interjected, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "Because someone's protection fees left us nothing to maintain anything with." The silence that followed felt like the moment before a gunfight. Stone's face darkened, but before he could respond, Hamilton stepped forward. "Interesting timing," he said, his quiet voice somehow carrying clearly. "Mining company shows up right when they know the town's most vulnerable." "What are you suggesting?" Stone demanded, though Hamilton caught the flicker in his eyes. 7 years ago, I saw something similar in Colorado. Mining company would squeeze a town, then a protector would appear, offering to fight them off. What folks didn't know was the protector was working for the company all along. Squeeze from both ends, until there's nothing left but dust and broken dreams. The accusation hung in the air like gun smoke. Stone's hand drifted toward his rifle, but Ezra spoke first. "That's a lie. Pa's been protecting us. Tell them, Pa. Tell them how you drove off the mining company men last month." "Did he?" Hamilton asked gently. "Or did they just happen to leave after your father had collected his monthly dues? Interesting coincidence, that timing." "You've got a mighty loose tongue for a man who claims to follow the good book," Stone growled. But Hamilton noticed how many townspeople were now watching their protector with new eyes. "Scripture says, 'Ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free,'" Hamilton quoted. "Truth is, this town's being bled dry from both ends. Mining company squeezes, you protect, and somehow you're the only one who ever seems to prosper." Dr. Chen pushed off from her wall. "He's right. Every month I treat more people who can't pay for care. Children going hungry while their parents work claims that barely produce. And somehow the Stone family never seems to want for anything. We've kept this town alive," Stone roared, his careful facade cracking. "Without us, the mining company would have—" "Would have what?" Rebecca's voice was ice. "Taken everything, left us with nothing? How's that different from what you've done, Pa?" The saloon doors swung open, and Clayton, the undertaker, hurried in. "Riders coming! Must be 30 of them, mining company men by the look of their gear." Panic threatened to erupt, but Hamilton's voice cut through the chaos. "Mr. Stone," he said, each word measured and clear, "seems like your friends are early. Didn't expect them till dawn, did you?" Stone's rifle came up, but this time it pointed straight at Hamilton. "You've said enough, Lightning Jack. Time for you to—" The gun disappeared from Stone's hand so fast that most eyes couldn't follow the movement. One moment it was there, the next Hamilton held it, cleared of ammunition, its lever working with a sound like destiny's clock ticking. "7 years since I moved that fast," Hamilton said quietly, his hands steady despite the speed they'd just displayed. "Promised myself never again, but some promises have to bend so others can be kept." The room had gone deathly still. Even Stone seemed frozen, staring at his empty hands as if they belonged to someone else. "Town's got a choice to make," Hamilton continued, laying the empty rifle on the bar. "Keep living under two masters, both feeding on your fear, or stand together. Mining companies coming, sure enough. Question is, are they coming to face a divided town, each man scared of his own shadow? Or are they coming to face people who've remembered who they are?" Walsh, the blacksmith, stepped forward. "I didn't come west to bow to mining companies or pay protection to false friends. I say we show them both what Rattlesnake Junction is made of." Other voices joined his, years of fear transforming into something else, something that looked remarkably like hope. Hamilton watched it spread through the crowd, like sunrise after a long night. Stone looked around the room, seeing his power crumbling like desert sand. "You're all fools," he spat. "You think pretty words and noble ideas can stop bullets? Can keep your children fed?" "No," Hamilton replied, touching his Bible, "but they can remind us what's worth fighting for. And sometimes, Mr. Stone, remembering that is all the protection a town needs." Outside, the thunder of approaching hooves grew louder, and with it came the moment of truth for Rattlesnake Junction. As Hamilton watched the townspeople begin to organize, he reflected that sometimes the fastest draw wasn't about speed at all. It was about knowing when to stand your ground, and what ground was worth standing on. The mining company riders halted at the edge of town, their horses' hooves raising dust clouds that caught the last rays of sunlight. Hamilton watched from the saloon's doorway as Marcus and Hank nervously fingered their gun belts, while Stone stood rigid, his empty hands clenched at his sides, the moment stretched like a bowstring pulled too tight. 34 men, Hamilton said quietly to Rebecca, who stood beside him. "All armed, all experienced. Your stepfather doesn't look surprised to see them so early." "Because he isn't," she replied, her hand resting on her hidden revolver. "I found the telegram in his office this morning. He's been coordinating with them for months." The lead rider, a man in an expensive Eastern suit that looked out of place in the desert dust, urged his horse forward. "Mr. Stone," he called out, his voice carrying the cultured accent of someone unused to raising it. "I trust you've prepared the town for our arrival." Before Stone could respond, Dr. Chen stepped into the street, her medical bag in hand. "Mr. Harrison, isn't it? From the Boston office. Funny, your company's letters said you weren't due till next month." Harrison's practiced smile flickered. "Plans change, my dear, especially when we hear rumors of unrest in our territories." Hamilton noticed how the mining company men had spread out, taking positions that covered every escape route from the town center. Professional work, reminiscent of military tactics he'd seen during the war. These weren't ordinary hired guns. These were trained killers. "Unrest?" Walsh called from his position by the smithy. "That what you call people standing up for themselves?" Now, Harrison's voice took on a patronizing tone. "Let's not make this difficult. We have legitimate court orders, and Mr. Stone has assured us of your cooperation." The betrayal hung in the air like storm clouds. Ezra turned to his father, confusion and hurt warring on his young face. "Pa? What's he talking about?" Stone's expression hardened. Sometimes, boy, protection means knowing when to make a deal. Mining company gets the water rights. We get a percentage and guaranteed positions. Town still survives. Survives? Rebecca's laugh was bitter as desert wind. You mean you survive? Rest of us just exist on whatever scraps you and your mining friends decide to throw our way. Hamilton watched the tension building, saw fingers tightening on triggers all around the street. One wrong move, one spark of violence, and Rattlesnake Junction would become a bloodbath. He'd seen it before, too many times. But something was different here. Something in the way the townspeople stood their ground. Fear giving way to determination. Then young Billy Chen, the doctor's nephew, broke free from his aunt's grasp and ran into the street after a rolling candy hoop. Time seemed to slow as Hamilton saw Marcus's gun clear leather, the young hothead's nerves finally snapping. What happened next would be debated in Rattlesnake Junction for years to come. Hamilton moved like his old nickname, like lightning. Before Marcus's gun was level, it was spinning in the dust. Before anyone else could react, 3 more guns had been plucked from hands so fast it seemed like magic, and there stood Lightning Jack Hamilton, Bible still tucked under his arm, 4 guns laid carefully on the ground at his feet. 7 years, he said into the stunned silence, his voice carrying clearly down the street. 7 years since I moved that fast. Promised myself never again. He looked at Billy, now safe in his aunt's arms. Some promises bend so others can be kept. Harrison's composure cracked. The famous Lightning Jack, Stone, you didn't tell us because he didn't know. Hamilton interrupted. Not really. He knew the name, knew the stories, but he didn't know why I gave up the guns, why I chose a different path. His eyes swept the assembled crowd. It's because I learned that speed doesn't solve problems. It just creates widows and orphans faster. Noble sentiments, Harrison sneered, but we still have the law on our side, and more men than you can disarm, even with your legendary speed. The law? Dr. Chen stepped forward, holding up a stack of papers. You mean these documents I telegraphed to the territorial judge last week? The ones showing how your company's been forging land claims. Funny thing about paper trails, they move faster than bullets. Hamilton saw the shift in the mining company men's posture, professionals recognizing when a job had gone bad. Harrison's face had lost its cultured veneer, showing something uglier beneath. This isn't over, he snarled. Stone, do something. But Jeremiah Stone was looking at his son, seeing perhaps for the first time the cost of his choices written on Ezra's face. No, he said quietly. I think it is over. Pa. Ezra's voice carried years of questions. I forgot something, son, Stone replied, his shoulders slumping. Forgot that real protection isn't about force. It's about standing with people, not standing over them. He turned to the town. I've done wrong by you all. Can't change that, but maybe I can start making it right. Harrison's laugh was ugly. Touching family moment, but sentiment doesn't change facts. This town's dying anyway. We're just making it quick and profitable. No, Hamilton said, stepping forward. This town's remembering who it is, and memory, Mr. Harrison, is more powerful than any paper you can forge or gun you can hire. The sun had fully set now, painting the sky in colors of judgment and redemption. In the gathering dark, Hamilton saw something he'd been searching for since he'd first picked up the good book. The moment when fear gave way to faith, when people remembered they were stronger standing together than kneeling apart. The fastest drawer in the West hadn't needed to fire a shot. Sometimes, he reflected, the quickest way to end a fight was to remind people why it wasn't worth starting. The night settled over Rattlesnake Junction like a wool blanket, heavy and warm. Inside Walsh's smithy, the remnants of the day's confrontation gathered around the glowing forge. Hamilton watched the interplay of light and shadow on their faces as they planned their next moves. Dr. Chen spread her documents across the workbench, the papers containing evidence of the mining company's corruption illuminated by lantern light. "They'll be back," Rebecca said, cleaning her revolver with practiced precision. Harrison's type always comes back. Wounded pride's more dangerous than wounded flesh. Walsh hammered at a piece of glowing metal, each strike punctuating his words. "Let them come. Town's different now. We remember who we are." Hamilton studied the gathered faces. Walsh, his massive arms scarred from years at the forge, embodying the town's strength. Dr. Chen, her clever eyes missing nothing, representing its wisdom. Rebecca, her guard finely lowered, showing its heart. And surprisingly, Jeremiah Stone, seated in the corner, his usual confidence replaced by something approaching humility. "Remembering's not enough," Hamilton said quietly. "Memory without action is just nostalgia. We need to be ready." Stone cleared his throat. "Mining companies got men stationed at Three Rocks Pass and Eagle's Bluff. Used to coordinate with them when—" He trailed off, then squared his shoulders. "Well, I know their positions, their habits." "Why help us now?" Dr. Chen asked, her tone carrying years of distrust. Stone looked at his hands, as if seeing them for the first time. "Because Lightning Jack reminded me of something. When I first came here, I really did want to protect people. Somewhere along the way, protection became power, and power became—" He gestured helplessly. "Became its own kind of prison." Hamilton finished. "Fear works both ways, Mr. Stone. Those who deal in it end up just as trapped as those they frighten." The smithy door opened, admitting Ezra and a group of young townspeople. They carried an assortment of tools and weapons, their faces showing a curious mixture of determination and uncertainty. "Got the others organized," Ezra reported. "Cal's watching the North Road. Mary's got folks preparing the church basement as a refuge, and Jim's gathering supplies." He looked at his father, something like hope in his eyes. "Did I miss anything?" Stone started to speak, then stopped, looking at Hamilton. The former gunslinger nodded encouragingly. "You did good, son," Stone said softly. "Better than your old man deserved." Walsh placed the finished piece in cooling water, steam rising like phantom breath. "That's all well and good, but Harrison's men are professionals. Town's got heart now, sure, but heart don't stop bullets." "No," Hamilton agreed, touching his Bible, "but it gives people something worth standing for. And when people stand together, really stand together, even professionals think twice about the cost of forcing them down." Dr. Chen rolled up her documents carefully. "Speaking of cost, these'll help, but Harrison's company has deep pockets. They could tie us up in court for years. Unless," Rebecca interjected, "we make it too expensive for them, not just in money but in reputation." She turned to Hamilton. "You said you saw something similar in Colorado." Hamilton nodded. "Mining company tried the same tactics in a town called Mercy Falls. But when the story got out, how they'd tried to steal a town's water, how they'd hired gunmen to threaten families, their Eastern investors got nervous. Money's got no loyalty except to itself. I know a newspaper man in Santa Fe," Walsh offered. "Honest sort, likes nothing better than exposing corporate misconduct. If we could get him here." "Harrison's men have the roads watched," Stone reminded them. "Anyone trying to leave would be spotted." A slow smile spread across Dr. Chen's face. "Unless they were in my supply wagon. Mining companies used to seeing it come and go. I treat their men too, after all." The planning continued as midnight approached. Hamilton watched the townspeople working together, each contributing their knowledge, their skills, their courage. This, he reflected, was what he'd been seeking in all his years of wandering. Not just peace, but purpose. Not just the absence of violence, but the presence of something worth preserving. Ezra approached him during a lull in the discussion. "Mr. Hamilton, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "How'd you do it? Give up the guns, I mean, after being the fastest." Hamilton considered the question carefully. Wasn't about giving up speed, son. Was about choosing what to use it for. Every gift can heal or harm. It's the heart behind it that matters. Like Pa, Ezra said quietly. He's got gifts too. Leadership, strength. Just use them wrong. People can change, Hamilton replied, watching Stone deep in discussion with Walsh about defensive positions. Sometimes they just need to be reminded of who they meant to be before the world taught them to be something else. Rebecca joined them, her revolver finally cleaned and loaded. Town's changing too, can feel it in the air. Fear going out, hope coming in, Hamilton agreed. Seen it before, but it never gets less miraculous. The door opened again, admitting young Billy Chen with a tray of coffee cups. The boy who'd inadvertently triggered Hamilton's display of speed now moved with purpose, distributing the drinks with serious concentration. "Miss Rebecca," Billy said as he handed her a cup, "Mom says to tell you the women's group is ready. They've got everything prepared like you asked." Rebecca smiled. "Good man, Billy. Tell them we'll be ready when Harrison makes his move." Hamilton watched the boy hurry out, remembering another young man in another town, years ago, who'd helped him see that there were better ways to use his gifts than dealing death. "You know," Dr. Chen said, joining them with her own coffee, "for a man who claims to be just passing through, you've put down some deep roots here." Hamilton looked around the smithy at these people who'd gone from strangers to allies in the space of a day. "Sometimes," he said softly, "a man doesn't choose his ground. Sometimes the ground chooses him." Outside, the desert wind carried the promise of dawn, and with it, the certainty that Harrison would return. But now, as Hamilton watched the people of Rattlesnake Junction preparing together, he knew that what the mining company would find wouldn't be the same divided, fearful town they'd left. The fastest drawer in the West had found something worth standing still for. Dawn painted Rattlesnake Junction in shades of gold and promise as Hamilton sat on the boarding house's back porch, his Bible open but unread in his lap. Dr. Chen joined him, offering a steaming cup of coffee as she settled into the neighboring chair. "You never finished that story," she said quietly. "In Atlanta, after you helped me with the wounded. You disappeared before telling us why the fastest gun in 3 territories decided to walk away from it all." Hamilton's fingers traced the brass crucifix on his Bible's cover, feeling the familiar contours that had replaced the smooth grip of his revolvers. "Some stories are harder to tell than others, Doctor." "Sarah," she corrected, "after all this, I think we're past formalities. And sometimes the hardest stories are the ones that need telling most." The rising sun caught the edge of Hamilton's scar, making it stand out stark against his weathered face. "It wasn't one moment," he began, his voice carrying the weight of years. "Wasn't like being struck by lightning on the road to Damascus. It was more like watching a sunset, so gradual you don't notice until suddenly the light's gone." He paused, sipping the coffee. "Started in '63, outside Vicksburg. I was already known as Lightning Jack by then. Had a reputation for being fastest and most accurate. Military wanted me training sharpshooters, but I preferred working alone. More effective that way, I thought. What changed? Got assigned to protect a supply train, critical medical supplies, heading to field hospitals on both sides, part of a temporary truce arrangement. That's where I met a preacher named Augustus Brown. Man carried a Bible in one hand and a doctor's bag in the other. Said he served 2 healers, the great physician above and anyone below who needed mending." Sarah nodded, understanding dawning in her eyes. "That's why you recognized my techniques. They weren't just battlefield medicine." Brother Brown had learned from Chinese missionaries, Indian medicine men, frontier doctors. Said wisdom didn't care what uniform you wore or what God you prayed to. Train got attacked by deserters, men so desperate they'd steal from the dying. I did what I did best. Drew faster, shot straighter, killed 7 men in less than 10 seconds. Hamilton's voice grew distant. Brown didn't condemn me, just asked me to help him tend the wounded, including the deserters I'd shot, made me look in their eyes, learn their names, hear their stories. Every man I'd dropped had someone waiting for them, had dreams beyond the next meal or the next fight. "But you were defending innocent people," Sarah protested. "Those supplies were needed." That's what I told myself. But Brown said something I couldn't shake. Said every bullet finds its mark twice, once when it hits its target, and once when it hits the shooter's soul. Said a man can only carry so many souls before his own starts to crack under the weight. The sun had cleared the horizon now, turning the desert into a sea of light. In the distance, they could hear the town awakening, preparing for whatever the day might bring. "Kept working with him after that," Hamilton continued. "Between assignments, I'd help at his field hospitals. Started seeing the other side of my reputation, not just the speed of my draw, but the weight of its consequences. Every man I killed had a story. Every bullet I fired wrote an ending that couldn't be undone." "The scar," Sarah said softly. "That's where it finally changed, isn't it?" Hamilton touched the mark unconsciously. Last assignment of the war. Was supposed to eliminate a Confederate officer who'd been particularly effective at hitting our supply lines. Found him in a field hospital. He'd been wounded trying to get medicine for his men. Brother Brown was there, tending both sides as usual. He fell silent for a long moment. Officer recognized me. Drew faster than anyone I'd ever seen. Almost as fast as me. Almost. I put him down, but his bullet caught me here. He traced the scar. Brown saved my life, patched me up, but while I was healing, he made me read to the wounded, from this very Bible. Made me see that every man in those beds, blue or grey, was more than just a target, more than just a job. So you walked away. Not right away. Tried to keep going. Told myself I was on the right side of things, but every face I saw turned into one of those hospital patients. Every man I was supposed to kill had a story I couldn't help but imagine. Eventually, the weight got too heavy. Sarah studied him over her coffee cup. "But you still have the speed. We all saw that yesterday." "Speed was never the problem. It was a gift, like your healing hands or Walsh's strength. Problem was what I chose to do with it. Brown taught me that every gift can heal or harm. It's the heart behind it that matters." "And now?" Sarah's question held more than professional curiosity. "What does your heart tell you about staying in Rattlesnake Junction?" Hamilton looked out over the awakening town, seeing the people moving with new purpose, working together without fear for the first time in years. Brother Brown used to say that a man doesn't always choose his mission. Sometimes the mission chooses him. Maybe this town needs more than just the fastest draw in the West. Maybe it needs someone who learned the hard way that true strength isn't about how fast you can take life, but how steadfastly you can defend it. "The mining company won't see it that way," Sarah warned. "Harrison's type only understands the language of violence." "Maybe," Hamilton agreed, closing his Bible. "But I learned another language in those field hospitals. Language of healing, of hope, and sometimes that's the most powerful language of all." As if to punctuate his words, the church bell began to ring, calling the town to face whatever the day might bring. Hamilton stood, offering Sarah his hand. Time to see if Rattlesnake Junction's ready to learn a new language too. The morning sun had barely cleared the mountains when the first shots echoed across Rattlesnake Junction. Hamilton stood in the street, watching smoke rise from the north end of town, where the mining company men had fired the Chen family's barn. The message was clear. This was only the beginning. "They're testing us," Rebecca said, joining him with her revolver drawn, "seeing how we'll respond." "More than that," Hamilton replied, watching townspeople rush to fight the flames. "They're trying to divide us, make us choose between defending different parts of town." Walsh emerged from his smithy, carrying water buckets. "Bastards picked their target well. Chen family's barn is far enough out that by the time we got the fire under control, they could hit somewhere else." Hamilton studied the rising smoke, his mind working like it once had when calculating shot distances. Sarah's supply wagon left for Santa Fe an hour ago. Harrison's men will be focused on watching the main roads, making sure our message doesn't get out. "Which means they'll be spread thin," Stone added, approaching with Ezra close behind. Both men carried rifles, though Hamilton noticed how Stone's hands shook slightly on his weapon. "I know their positions, remember?" "They'll have at least 15 men watching the roads, leaving fewer for actual attacks," Rebecca finished, understanding dawning in her eyes. "They're not just testing us, they're showing us what happens if we resist." The fire at the barn was nearly contained now, thanks to the bucket line of townspeople working together. Hamilton watched their coordination, their unity, and saw something Harrison had missed. Each crisis wasn't weakening the town, it was strengthening it. "Mr. Hamilton!" Young Billy Chen came running up, his face smudged with soot. "Riders coming from the south, at least 10 of them." Before Hamilton could respond, shots rang out from the west end of town. More smoke began rising, this time from the direction of the livery stable. "They're splitting us up," Stone growled, "forcing us to divide our defense." Hamilton's voice cut through the growing chaos. "No, they're forcing us to choose, property or people. They think we'll break when we realize we can't save everything." "Then what do we do?" Ezra asked, his young face showing the strain of command. "We show them what real strength looks like," Hamilton replied. "Rebecca, take the South group. Show them what a Stone really stands for. Walsh, get your people to the livery. Not to save the building, to make sure everyone's safe." "What about you?" Rebecca asked, already moving to carry out his instructions. "Going to have a conversation with some gentleman at the Chen barn." Hamilton started walking, his stride purposeful. Time they learned the difference between fear and respect. He'd covered half the distance when he heard hoofbeats behind him. Stone and Ezra had followed, their rifles ready. "Don't recall asking for company," Hamilton said, without slowing. "Don't recall needing permission in my own town," Stone replied, then caught himself. "Our town." They found 5 mining company men watching the barn burn, their satisfaction evident in their relaxed postures. Hamilton recognized the type. Men who enjoyed breaking things, who mistook cruelty for strength. "Quite a show," Hamilton called out, causing them to turn sharply. "Though I've always found it interesting how brave men get when they're burning other people's property." The lead man, a weathered character with a cavalry sergeant's bearing, squinted at them. "This doesn't concern you, old man. Mining company's just protecting its interests." "Interesting way to protect something," Hamilton replied, stepping closer. "Usually protection doesn't involve destroying the thing you're claiming to protect. Sometimes you have to break something to show you're serious about owning it," another man sneered. "Ownership." Hamilton's voice carried the weight of experience. "Funny thing about that, man can own a thing, but he can't own a people's spirit, can't own their dignity, though Lord knows many have tried." The sergeant's hand drifted toward his gun. "Pretty words, preacher, but words don't stop lead." "No," Hamilton agreed, "they don't. But they can remind a man of who he is, what he stands for." He looked each man in the eye. "You were soldiers once, cavalry by your bearing, fought for something bigger than yourselves. Now look at you, burning barns to frighten farmers." The words hit home. Hamilton saw it in their shifting stances, the uncertainty creeping into their expressions. "You don't know anything about us," the sergeant growled, but there was less conviction in his voice. "I know the look of men following orders they're ashamed of. Saw it during the war, in the eyes of good men forced to do things that haunted them later." Hamilton took another step forward. "Question is, how many haunts you want to carry?" The tension stretched like a wire about to snap. Then, unexpectedly, Stone spoke. He's right. The former strongman's voice carried the rough edge of confession. I've been where you are, telling myself I was protecting people while really just serving someone else's greed. It eats at you year by year until you can't recognize yourself in the mirror. The mining company men exchanged glances. The sergeant's hand moved away from his gun. Harrison won't like this, he warned. Harrison isn't the one who has to live with your choices, Hamilton replied. You are. For a long moment no one moved. Then the sergeant turned his horse. Come on, boys. Show's over. As they rode away, Ezra let out a breath he'd been holding. How'd you know they'd listen? Didn't, Hamilton admitted, but sometimes a man just needs to be reminded of the road he's on and where it leads. Stone studied the smouldering barn. Harrison won't take this well. He'll send others, ones who don't have any conscience left to appeal to. Probably, Hamilton agreed, but every man who walks away is one less we have to fight. And sometimes the battles you don't have to fight are the most important ones to win. In the distance, more shots rang out from the direction of the livery. The day's trials were far from over. But as Hamilton watched Stone and his son move to help the Chen family salvage what they could from the barn, he saw something Harrison's tactics couldn't touch. The strength of people who'd remembered who they were meant to be. The fastest draw in the West hadn't needed his speed today. Sometimes, he reflected, the quickest way to end a fight was to remind men of the cost of starting one. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the church windows as Hamilton addressed the gathered townspeople. The morning's attacks had left everyone on edge, but there was something else in their faces now, determination replacing fear, purpose overshadowing doubt. Speed isn't what makes a gunfighter dangerous, Hamilton explained, his voice carrying to every corner of the sanctuary. It's knowing what's going to happen before it happens, reading people, reading situations. That's what keeps you alive. Walsh leaned forward on his pew. And how do we learn that? We're not gunfighters. No, Hamilton agreed. You're something better. You're people with something worth protecting. That gives you an advantage Harrison's men don't have. They're fighting for money. You're fighting for home. Rebecca stood by the window, keeping watch, while participating in the discussion. Pa, Jeremiah, taught us how to shoot, but this feels different. Because it is, Hamilton replied. Stone taught you to fight with fear. I'm teaching you to defend with purpose. Watch how Harrison's men move when they come into town. They're predictable because they're following patterns they've used before. Like this morning's attacks, Ezra interjected. They hit the outlying buildings first, tried to divide our attention. Hamilton nodded approvingly. Exactly. They've done this before in other towns, but you did something they didn't expect. You chose people over property. That confused them, disrupted their pattern. Sarah Chen, who had returned from her supply wagon mission successful but exhausted, spoke up from her position near the altar. But they'll adapt, won't they? Try something new. They will, Hamilton confirmed, but so will we. Stone, tell them what you noticed about their positions during the morning attacks. Jeremiah Stone stood slowly, the mantle of leadership sitting differently on his shoulders now. They're running their operations out of the old Carson mine, using the abandoned tunnels to move unseen. It's how they manage to hit different parts of town so quickly. Which means they have to follow certain paths, Hamilton added. The tunnels only run in certain directions. Knowing that gives us an advantage. But they're still professional gunmen, someone called from the back. We're just townspeople. Hamilton's voice took on an edge of steel. During the war, I saw farmers with pitchforks hold off trained cavalry, saw shopkeepers turn their stores into fortresses. Being professional at violence doesn't make you stronger. It just makes you better at destroying things. He moved to the center of the church, every eye following him. You want to know what real strength is? It's the barber who keeps his shop open despite threats, because people need a place to gather and share news. It's the school teacher who keeps teaching, because children need to know the world is more than violence. It's neighbors helping neighbors, standing together when it would be easier to stand aside. Walsh stood, his massive frame casting shadows in the afternoon light. "Tell us what you need us to do." For the next hour, Hamilton laid out his plans. He showed them how to read approaching riders' intentions from the way they sat their horses, taught them to watch for the subtle signs that preceded violence, the shift in stance, the change in breathing, the telltale tension in shoulders before a draw. Most importantly, he emphasized, you need to trust each other. Harrison's men are individuals fighting for pay. You're a community fighting for survival. That's your real strength. Rebecca joined him at the front. "We've organized watches. Every street, every alley has eyes on it now. Women, children, everyone has a part to play." "Good," Hamilton nodded, "because tonight's when they'll try something bigger. They lost face this morning when their men walked away from the barn. Harrison won't let that stand." "How can you be sure?" Ezra asked. "Because I've known men like Harrison. Pride is their weakness. They can't stand being defied, especially by people they consider beneath them." Stone cleared his throat. "He's right. I was the same way. Couldn't let any challenge to my authority go unanswered. Made me predictable." "Then we'll use that predictability," Hamilton said. "Dr. Chen, your clinic ready?" Sarah nodded. "Supplies are hidden where they can't be burned. Got people stationed nearby with water in case they try to fire it." "Walsh?" The blacksmith's grin was fierce. "Smithy's ready. They try to burn it, they'll get a surprise. Got something special prepared in the forge." Hamilton looked around the church at these people who had gone from victims to defenders in the space of a day. "Remember, you're not learning to fight. You're learning to protect. There's a difference. Fighting is about destroying something. Protection is about preserving something." "What about you?" Rebecca asked quietly. "You've taught us so much, but you still won't carry a gun." "Because that's not my role anymore," Hamilton replied, touching his Bible. "My job is to remind you that strength comes in many forms. Speed with a gun is just one kind of power. What you're building here, trust, unity, common purpose, that's a power Harrison can't shoot his way through." The sun was setting now, painting the church windows in colors of fire and faith. Hamilton watched as the townspeople broke into groups, each knowing their role in the night to come. They moved with purpose now, with confidence born not of bravado, but of understanding. "Brother Brown would be proud," Sarah said softly, joining him at the window. "You've turned their fear into strength." "No," Hamilton corrected. "They did that themselves. I just reminded them they could." He watched as Walsh led a group toward the smithy, while Rebecca organized the roof watchers. "Every person here has something to teach, something to contribute. That's what Harrison doesn't understand. He thinks because he can destroy things, he's powerful. But real power is in building things, preserving things." "Like hope?" Sarah's question carried a smile. "Especially hope," Hamilton agreed, "because hope, properly taught, properly nurtured, is the one thing bullets can't kill." The church bell rang, signaling the change of watch. As the townspeople moved to their positions, Hamilton reflected that sometimes the best teaching happened not through words but through example. These people didn't need the fastest draw in the West. They needed to remember their own strength. And as the night approached, bringing with it the certainty of conflict, that strength was shining brighter than any gun could flash. Night had fallen over Rattlesnake Junction, bringing with it a silence that seemed to hold its breath. Hamilton stood in the shadow of the church steeple, watching the moonlit streets below. The town's defenses were in place. Walsh's smithy fortified, Chen's clinic protected, lookouts posted at every strategic point. Yet something nagged at his instincts, a disquiet he couldn't quite name. Rebecca appeared beside him, moving with the silence her years under Stone's tutelage had taught her. "Marcus is missing," she whispered. "Hasn't reported in for his watch." Hamilton's unease crystallized into certainty. "Who else knows the tunnel system besides your stepfather?" "Marcus helped map them when—" Rebecca's voice trailed off as understanding dawned. "When Pa first started working with the mining company, he knows every passage." Before Hamilton could respond, a flash of movement caught his eye, a shadow detaching itself from the darkness near Walsh's smithy. The figure moved with purpose, heading not toward the town's defenses, but away from them. "Get Stone and Ezra," Hamilton instructed quietly. "Tell them to meet me at the old Carson mine entrance. And Rebecca—" He caught her arm as she turned to go. "Be careful who you trust with that information." She nodded, understanding the warning, and disappeared into the night. Hamilton made his way through the sleeping town, his years of experience allowing him to move as silently as a prayer. The old mine entrance loomed before him, its timbers skeletal in the moonlight. "Figured you'd be the one to spot it." Dr. Chen's voice came from the shadows, causing Hamilton to turn sharply. She emerged from behind a stack of weathered lumber, her medical bag in hand. "Marcus came to the clinic earlier, said he'd twisted his ankle in the tunnels, but his boots had fresh mud, the kind you only find near the creek, not in the mines." "You followed him?" "Didn't have to. Been treating mining company men long enough to recognize their boot prints. Found these leading from the tunnel entrance." She handed Hamilton a folded paper. In the moonlight, he could make out a crude map of the town's defenses. "He's been feeding them information," Hamilton said, the pieces falling into place. "All day while we were planning, he was memorizing our preparations." "Why?" Stone's voice joined them, accompanied by Rebecca and Ezra. "Boy's been with us since the beginning. He believed in what we were doing." "Did he?" Hamilton asked quietly. "Or did he believe in the image of power you presented? The strong man protecting his people through force?" He saw Stone flinch at the words but pressed on. "When that image cracked, when he saw you change, maybe he looked for another kind of strength to follow." A noise from the tunnel entrance silenced them. Marcus emerged, followed by 3 mining company men. In the moonlight, his young face showed a curious mixture of triumph and uncertainty. "That's far enough," Hamilton called out, causing the group to freeze. Marcus's hand dropped to his gun, but Hamilton's voice stopped him. "Don't, son. You're faster than you were yesterday, but nowhere near fast enough." "You don't understand," Marcus said, his voice carrying a desperate edge. "The town's dying anyway. Harrison's offering a future, a real future, not just surviving on the edges of other people's prosperity." "And the price?" Rebecca asked, hurt and anger warring in her voice. "Just our souls, is that it?" "Better than our lives," Marcus shot back. "You all think you're so noble, standing together against the mining company. But they're the future. Men like Stone, men like Hamilton, they're the past. The war's over. It's time to choose the winning side." Hamilton studied the young man he'd helped train just hours before. "There's always a choice, Marcus. But sometimes the hardest part isn't making it, it's living with it afterward." One of the mining company men drew his pistol, but Hamilton moved faster than thought. The gun went spinning into the darkness, its owner clutching a numbed hand. The other 2 reached for their weapons, but stopped at the sound of multiple hammers being cocked. Walsh and several townspeople had emerged from hiding positions. "Harrison's men are coming," Marcus announced, his bravado cracking slightly. "Through all the tunnels. They know every weakness in your defenses now. By dawn, Rattlesnake Junction will be theirs." "No," Hamilton replied quietly. "By dawn, this town will belong to its people. The only question is whether you'll be standing with them or against them." Marcus's face twisted with confusion. "You're not even armed. All your talk about peace and protection. What good is that against men who are willing to do whatever it takes?" Being willing to do anything means you stand for nothing, Hamilton said. Is that really the future you want to choose? For a moment, doubt crossed Marcus's features. Then his hand darted for his gun. Hamilton moved with the speed that had made him legendary, but this time he didn't disarm the young man. He simply stepped inside his drawer, one hand gently catching Marcus's wrist, the other resting on his shoulder like a father's touch. "Every fast draw I ever saw," Hamilton said softly, "was just a man trying to prove something. To others, to himself. What are you trying to prove, son?" The gun slipped from Marcus's nerveless fingers as tears began tracking down his face. I wanted to be strong like Stone used to be." "Or I was never strong," Stone said, stepping forward. "I was just good at making people afraid. Real strength." He gestured at the townspeople emerging from the shadows. "Real strength is standing together when it would be easier to stand aside. It's choosing what's right over what's easy." "Harrison's men are still coming," one of the mining company men warned, though Hamilton noticed how he kept his hands well away from his weapons. "Let them come," Walsh growled. "Town's got a few surprises they don't know about." Hamilton released Marcus, who stood as if lost between two worlds. "Choice is still yours, son. But remember, strength without purpose is just another kind of weakness." The night wind carried the sound of distant hoofbeats. Harrison's main force was approaching. Marcus looked at his former friends, at the mining company men, at the town he'd betrayed, and the future he'd thought he wanted. "I can't undo what I did," he said finally, his voice small in the darkness. "No," Hamilton agreed, "but you can choose what you do next. That's the thing about choices. There's always another one waiting to be made." The hoofbeats grew louder as Marcus made his decision. And in that moment, as the fastest drawer in the West watched a young man choose between past and future, he reflected that sometimes the greatest battles weren't won with speed or strength, but with the patience to let others find their own path to redemption. The thundering of hooves grew louder as Harrison's men emerged from the darkness, their numbers seeming to multiply in the deceptive moonlight. Hamilton counted at least 40 riders, their weapons gleaming with deadly promise. Behind him, Marcus stood frozen between loyalty and betrayal, his decision still hanging in the balance like a dropped coin yet to land. Harrison himself rode at the head of the column, his eastern refinement replaced by something harder, more primal. The mining company man had shed his civilized veneer, revealing the predator beneath. He reined in 20 yards from the mine entrance, his cold eyes taking in the scene. "I'm disappointed, Marcus," Harrison called out, his cultured voice carrying an edge of steel. "You were supposed to lead them into the tunnels, not warn them of our approach." "He didn't warn us," Hamilton replied before Marcus could speak. "We've known about your plans since sunset. Your man here just confirmed what we already suspected." And the lie was a gift, a chance for redemption that Hamilton watched settle on Marcus's shoulders. The young man straightened slightly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Doesn't matter," Harrison smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "Your defenses are compromised, your positions known. Did you really think a few townspeople with farming tools could stand against professional gunmen?" As if in answer, shots rang out from the direction of the town. Fire blossomed in several buildings, not Walsh's smithy or Chen's clinic, but the empty structures they'd fortified as decoys. Harrison's smile widened. "Your preparations were admirable but predictable. While you were watching the tunnels, my men were moving into position above ground. By now, they'll have control of every strategic point in town." Stone stepped forward, his rifle held steady. "You're lying. We have people posted—" "Had people posted," Harrison corrected. "Amazing what a few well-placed bribes can accomplish. Not everyone shares your newfound faith in unity, Stone. Some still believe in the old way, the strong taking what they want." Hamilton felt the wave of uncertainty ripple through the townspeople around him. More fires were visible now, their glow painting the night sky in shades of defeat. The sound of scattered gunfire echoed through the streets, along with shouts and the crash of breaking glass. "Last chance," Harrison announced. "Surrender now. Sign over your water rights and property deeds, and we'll let you leave with your lives. Resist and—" He gestured at the burning town behind them. Rebecca's voice cracked like a whip. "And what? You'll kill us all? Turn this place into a ghost town? What good is a mining operation without workers, without support?" "Workers can be imported," Harrison replied dismissively. "More tractable ones who understand their place in the natural order. Progress demands sacrifice, my dear. The weak must make way for the strong." Hamilton watched the fear beginning to take hold again in the faces around him. All their preparations, all their unity, seemed to be crumbling in the face of overwhelming force. Even Walsh's mighty shoulders had begun to slump. "You're right about one thing," Hamilton said into the smoky darkness. "The weak must make way for the strong. But you're wrong about what strength is." He stepped forward, empty hands raised to the moonlight. "I've seen real strength, saw it in field hospitals during the war, where doctors worked until they dropped to save lives on both sides. Saw it in small towns like this one, where people helped each other through drought and disaster. Saw it today, when this town chose to save lives instead of property." "Pretty speech," Harrison sneered, "but speeches don't stop bullets." "No," Hamilton agreed, "they don't, but they remind us what's worth dying for. And more importantly, what's worth living for." As if in response to his words, a new sound cut through the night, the church bell ringing out clear and strong. Then another bell joined it, and another, not the frantic alarm of warning, but the measured toll of defiance. "You see," Hamilton continued, his voice carrying over the bells, "while Marcus was feeding you information about our obvious preparations, others were making less obvious ones. Those fires you set, empty buildings, chosen to draw your attention, those strategic points you think you've captured, defended by people who've learned that strength isn't about who has the most guns." Sarah Chen's voice came from the darkness to their right. "Your men at the clinic just discovered that some medicines, when properly prepared, can put a man to sleep without harming him. Amazingly peaceful, really." Walsh's laugh boomed from the left. "And the ones who tried to take the smithy found out what happens when you heat iron plates all day, makes them a mite uncomfortable to climb on." More voices joined in, townspeople emerging from shadows and doorways, armed not just with weapons, but with purpose. Harrison's men shifted uneasily in their saddles as they realized they were slowly being surrounded. "You see," Hamilton said quietly, "real strength isn't about destruction. It's about preservation. Not about what you're willing to destroy, but what you're willing to protect." "Kill them all," Harrison snarled, raising his rifle. But before he could fire, Marcus moved. The young man's hand was nowhere near his gun. Instead, he struck the mining company leader's horse with his hat, causing the animal to rear. Harrison's shot went wild, and chaos erupted. What followed would be remembered in Rattlesnake Junction for generations, not as a battle, but as a revelation. Hamilton moved, like his namesake, not to kill but to disarm. His legendary speed turned to prevention rather than destruction. Townspeople emerged from every shadow, not with guns blazing, but with the coordinated purpose of those defending their home. The night grew darker still before dawn would come, but in that darkness, Rattlesnake Junction discovered what Hamilton had been trying to teach them. That true strength lay not in the ability to take life, but in the willingness to preserve it. The fastest draw in the West had taught them a different kind of speed, the speed with which hope could overcome fear, unity could defeat division, and preservation could triumph over destruction. The pre-dawn hours stretched like drawn wire over Rattlesnake Junction as Hamilton watched Harrison's men struggle against a kind of resistance they'd never encountered. From his position near the church, he could see Walsh's careful preparations bearing fruit. The mining company men who'd tried to secure the smithy found themselves trapped by ingeniously placed barriers, their horses unable to maneuver in the carefully constrained space. "Your father was right about one thing," Hamilton said to Rebecca as she joined him, her face streaked with soot from helping contain the defensive fires. "Sometimes protection means knowing how to control the battlefield." "But not the way he meant it," she replied, watching as Sarah Chen's sleeping draught took effect on another group of Harrison's men. The doctor had prepared her medicines with careful precision, ensuring they would incapacitate without harm. "We're not controlling through fear. We're controlling through preparation." Hamilton nodded, seeing his teachings take new form in the town's defensive strategy. Every alley had become a channel, every building a component in a larger plan. The townspeople weren't just defending their homes, they were transforming them into a unified whole. Stone emerged from the shadows, his rifle still unused at his side. Harrison's pulled his men back to the creek. They're regrouping, but something's different. They're not just confused, they're questioning. Because they've never faced opponents who valued preservation over destruction, Hamilton explained. Their strength comes from their willingness to destroy, when that doesn't work. A commotion near the general store drew their attention. Young Billy Chen was leading a group of children, their arms full of ropes and nets, the same materials they used for handling livestock. As Harrison's men had discovered, these tools were equally effective at entangling horses and riders. "It's working," Marcus said softly, joining them. The young man's face showed the strain of his choice, but also a growing certainty. The men Harrison brought in from outside, they're starting to argue with him. They signed on to intimidate townspeople, not fight a whole community that knows every inch of its ground. Hamilton watched as another of Harrison's tactical thrusts was turned back, not by gunfire, but by the coordinated efforts of townspeople working together. Walsh's smithy group had crafted makeshift barriers that could be quickly deployed and moved, channeling the attackers into prepared positions. Sarah Chen's medical knowledge had been transformed into a defensive weapon that harmed no one. Even the town's children had found ways to contribute, their simple tools becoming part of a complex strategy. "They're coming again," Rebecca warned, spotting movement at the creek. "Bigger push this time. Harrison's getting desperate." Indeed, the mining company leader had gathered his remaining men for what looked like a final assault. But something had changed in their formation. Their previous precision had given way to uncertainty, their confidence replaced by hesitation. "Now we show them what real strength looks like," Hamilton said quietly. "Walsh!" The blacksmith's voice boomed out in response, and suddenly the pre-dawn darkness was split by light. The decoy fires that had been burning all night had served another purpose, heating metal plates and barriers throughout the town. As Harrison's men charged, these obstacles began to glow with stored heat, creating channels that no horse would willingly cross. "Chen," Hamilton called next. The doctor's preparations revealed their full scope as hidden reservoirs of her sleeping medicine, carefully placed in water troughs and barrels, began to take effect on horses and riders who had been unwittingly exposed throughout the night. Not enough to harm, but enough to slow reflexes, dull reactions. Stone. The former strongman's knowledge of the town's layout proved crucial as prepositioned townspeople emerged from hiding places he had once used for his own purposes, now turned to the community's defense. Each group moved with practiced coordination, implementing plans they had rehearsed while Marcus's apparent betrayal had distracted Harrison's attention. But it was the youngest members of the town who provided the final element. Under Billy Chen's leadership, they deployed their ropes and nets with the skill born of countless cattle roundups. Horses stumbled, riders found themselves entangled, and the mining company's charge dissolved into confusion. Hamilton watched it all without touching a weapon, his hands clasped behind his back. "You see, Marcus, this is what I was trying to teach. Real strength isn't about what you can destroy. It's about what you can build, what you can coordinate, what you can achieve together." The young man nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. They never had a chance, did they? Not really, because they were fighting alone, each man for himself, while the town became something greater than the sum of its parts, Hamilton finished. That's what Harrison never understood. He thought he could break the town by breaking individual pieces, but when those pieces worked together, as if to demonstrate his point, Harrison's voice suddenly rang out in frustration. Fall back, damn you all." The mining company leader had finally recognized the futility of his position. His men, those still able to ride, were already retreating, their formations broken, their confidence shattered. Stone watched them go, his face showing a complex mixture of emotions. "We did it, without killing anyone, without becoming what they wanted us to be." "No," Hamilton corrected gently. "You became something they couldn't imagine. A community that found its strength not in weapons or wealth, but in unity and purpose." The first light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, revealing the full scope of what had happened. Harrison's mighty force had been defeated not by superior firepower, but by the coordinated efforts of an entire town. Farmers, shopkeepers, women, children, each had played their part in a strategy that valued preservation over destruction. As the sun rose over Rattlesnake Junction, Hamilton reflected that he had finally found what Brother Brown had tried to teach him all those years ago. True victory wasn't about being the fastest draw. It was about being wise enough to find solutions that didn't require drawing at all. The rising sun painted Rattlesnake Junction in shades of victory and vindication as Harrison stood alone in the town square, his fine eastern suit stained with dust and defeat. His men had retreated to the creek, leaving their leader to face the consequences of his miscalculation. The mining company man's composure had cracked, revealing the desperation beneath his cultivated facade. "This isn't over," Harrison declared, though his voice had lost its aristocratic certainty. "The company has resources you can't imagine. Other men, other methods, other towns to threaten." Hamilton stepped forward, his Bible still tucked beneath his arm. "Other communities to try to break. How's that been working for you this morning?" The townspeople had gathered in a wide circle, not with weapons drawn, but with the quiet confidence of those who had discovered their true strength. Walsh stood with his smithy workers, their faces streaked with honest labor. Sarah Chen had her medical bag ready, though this morning it held healing rather than tactical solutions. Stone and his son Ezra stood together, their previous divisions healed by shared purpose. "You think you've won something here?" Harrison's laugh held an edge of hysteria. "One night of clever tricks doesn't change the reality. The weak still make way for the strong. That's the law of nature." "No," Rebecca stepped forward, her father's ledgers in hand. "That's the excuse men like you use to justify taking what isn't yours. These show every false claim, every forged document, every bribe your company paid. The territorial judge has copies now, thanks to Sarah's supply wagon run." Harrison's hand dropped to his gun, but Hamilton was already moving. Before the mining company man could clear leather, his weapon went spinning across the dirt. This time, though, it wasn't Hamilton's legendary speed that had disarmed him. It was Marcus, using the very techniques he'd learned during the night's defense. "You see," Hamilton said quietly, "strength isn't about being the fastest or the most willing to do harm. It's about choosing what kind of power you want to wield. And who will believe you Harrison snarled, nursing his wrist. A washed-up gunslinger playing at redemption, a corrupt sheriff who turned on his employers, a town full of dirt farmers and failed miners. They'll believe this. Dr. Chen produced a stack of papers from her medical bag. Every treatment I've provided to your men over the months. Every injury from your enforcement activities. Every worker maimed in your unsafe mines, all documented, all witnessed, all legally certified. Walsh stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over Harrison. And they'll believe us. Every shopkeeper you squeezed, every farmer you threatened, every family you tried to break. We're not afraid anymore, and that means we're finally free to speak the truth. Harrison's composure cracked completely. With a cry of rage, he pulled a hidden derringer from his sleeve. Time seemed to slow as the small gun raised toward Hamilton. The fastest drawer in the West stood perfectly still, his empty hands at his sides, his eyes holding nothing but compassion for a man who had never understood true strength. Three things happened simultaneously. Rebecca's revolver cleared its holster. Stone's rifle came up, and Ezra moved to shield Hamilton. But before any of them could act, a lasso whirled through the morning air, wrapping around Harrison's arm. Billy Chen, perched on the general store's roof, grinned as he pulled the rope taut. "Been practicing that all night," the boy announced proudly, as Harrison's last weapon fell uselessly to the ground. The mining company man sagged in defeat, his borrowed power finally exhausted. "What now?" he asked bitterly. "Going to string me up? Show everyone how justice works in Rattlesnake Junction?" "No," Hamilton replied, helping him to his feet. "We're going to show you something you've never understood. Mercy. Because true strength isn't about how much you can hurt someone who's down. It's about having the power to hurt them and choosing not to." Sarah Chen stepped forward with her medical bag. "Your wrist needs tending," she said professionally, "and then I expect the territorial marshal will want to have a long conversation with you about business practices and legal documents." "Marshal's already on his way," Stone confirmed. "Should be here by sundown. Seems your company's activities have drawn quite a bit of official attention lately." Harrison looked around at the town he'd tried to break, seeing at last the power he'd never understood. Not just the physical defenses or clever tactics, but the deeper strength of a community that had remembered its own worth. Every face that met his gaze showed not hatred or vengeance, but the quiet dignity of people who had overcome fear. "I don't understand," he admitted finally. "You could finish this now. Make sure we never come back. Why show mercy?" Hamilton smiled gently. "Because that's the final lesson I learned after I put down my guns. Real victory isn't about destroying your enemy. It's about showing them a better way to live." The morning sun had fully risen now, illuminating a town transformed. Not just by the night's successful defense, but by the deeper changes that had taken root in its people. Walsh's smithy rang with honest labor rather than fear. Chen's clinic offered healing to friend and former foe alike. Stone and his son worked together to help clear the night's defensive works, their relationship rebuilt on a foundation of truth rather than power. As Hamilton watched Harrison being led away to await the marshal's arrival, he reflected that sometimes the greatest victories came not from what was won, but from what was finally, willingly let go. The fastest drawer in the West had found something better than speed. He had found a way to help others discover their own kind of strength. "Will they come back?" Marcus asked, joining him by the church steps. "The mining company, I mean. Will they try again?" Hamilton touched the brass crucifix on his Bible, remembering Brother Brown's words about battles of the spirit. "They might. But they'll find something different if they do, not just a town ready to defend itself, but a community that knows its own worth. And that, young man, is something no amount of money or guns can defeat." The church bell rang out once more, not in warning, but in celebration. As its clear tones carried across the morning air, Hamilton saw in the faces around him what he'd been seeking since he first put down his guns, the look of people who had found their own kind of speed, their own kind of strength, their own kind of victory. The territorial marshal arrived at sundown to find Rattlesnake Junction transformed, not just by the physical signs of the night's defense, but by something deeper, a fundamental shift in how the town carried itself. Hamilton watched from the church steps as Marshal Edwards, a weather-beaten man with eyes that missed nothing, took in the scene before him. "Interesting reports coming out of your town," Edwards commented, reviewing the evidence Dr. Chen and Rebecca had compiled. Mining company fraud, forced land acquisitions, hired gunmen threatening civilians. Wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen similar patterns in other territories. Sarah Chen stood nearby, her medical records adding weight to the town's case. Every injury documented, every threat recorded. We learned that sometimes the strongest defense is simply keeping careful account of the truth. The marshal nodded, his expression thoughtful as he studied Harrison, who sat under guard in Walsh's smithy. And like that, with his connections, should have known better than to leave such a clear paper trail. "Pride," Hamilton observed quietly, "makes men forget that true power isn't in what you can take, but in what you can build." Edwards turned to him, recognition dawning in his weathered face. "Lightning Jack Hamilton. Heard you'd given up the guns. Didn't expect to find you in the middle of something like this." "Sometimes the middle is exactly where you need to be," Hamilton replied, "especially when it's the middle of people finding their own kind of strength." The transformation of Rattlesnake Junction was evident in more than just its successful defense. Walsh's smithy had become more than a workplace. It was now a gathering point where townspeople shared information and planned improvements. The Chinese merchants, once isolated by fear, were now integral parts of the community's network. Even Stone's former enforcers had found new purpose, their skills turned to protection rather than intimidation. Rebecca approached, carrying a stack of deeds and water rights documents. "Marshal, you'll want to see these. Shows how the mining company manipulated property records across 3 territories." Edwards examined the papers, his eyebrows rising. "This goes beyond one town's water rights. This is systematic fraud on a territorial scale." He looked up at the gathered townspeople. "You understand what this means? Company will send lawyers, try to tie this up in court for years." "Let them come." Walsh's deep voice carried confidence rather than challenge. "Towns learned something about standing together. Whether it's against guns or legal papers, we know our strength now." Stone and Ezra emerged from the general store, where they'd been organizing supplies for families affected by the night's events. The former strongman's transformation was perhaps the most remarkable. His authority now came not from fear, but from a genuine desire to serve the community he'd once exploited. "Mining company's local office is already clearing out," Stone reported. "Seems word of what happened here traveled fast. Their workers are abandoning operations all along the creek." "Because they've seen a different way," Hamilton explained. "When one town stands up, shows their strength in unity rather than fear, others find their courage too." Marcus, who had spent the day helping repair damage from the night's defense, joined them. "Already getting visitors from Cedar Ridge and Copper Valley. They want to know how we did it. How we stood up to the mining company without becoming like them." The marshal closed his evidence folder with a decisive snap. "Well, seems to me Rattlesnake Junction's done more than just defend itself. You've provided a template for other towns facing similar pressure." He turned to Harrison. "Time to go, Mr. Harrison. Territorial court's very interested in having a conversation about your business practices." As Harrison was led away, Dr. Chen spoke up. "What about the mining company itself? They'll try to distance themselves from Harrison, claim he acted without authority." "That's why we kept such detailed records," Rebecca replied, a smile touching her lips. Every order signed, every directive documented. Harrison wasn't acting alone, and we can prove it. Hamilton watched as the townspeople continued their work of restoration and improvement. The knight's defensive measures were being transformed into permanent additions to the town's infrastructure. Walsh's clever barriers became new hitching posts and gathering areas. The communication network that had coordinated their defense now served to connect different parts of the community. "You know," Marshal Edwards said quietly to Hamilton, "when I heard Lightning Jack Hamilton was involved in a town's resistance to hired guns, I expected to find bodies. Instead, I find something I've never seen before, a community that defended itself without becoming what it fought against." "Because they learned what I learned," Hamilton replied, touching his Bible, "that the fastest draw isn't always the best answer. Sometimes the best victory is the one that leaves everyone standing, just standing differently than before." The marshal mounted up, Harrison and his evidence in tow. "Town's changed," he observed. "More than just defending itself, it's found something worth building on." "That's the real transformation," Hamilton agreed. "Not just standing against something, but standing for something, building something that guns and money can't touch." As the marshal's party disappeared into the gathering dusk, Hamilton watched the town continue its work of renewal. Children played freely in streets that had once been ruled by fear. Shopkeepers and farmers traded not just goods, but ideas for improvement. The Chinese merchants and American townspeople worked side by side, their former divisions forgotten in shared purpose. Stone approached, his face showing the peace of a man who had found a better way to lead. "You've given us something more valuable than protection," he said quietly. "You've shown us how to protect ourselves without losing our souls in the process." "No," Hamilton corrected gently. "You found that yourselves. I just reminded you it was possible." The church bell rang out once more, calling people to an evening meeting, not to plan defenses, but to discuss the town's future. As Hamilton watched them gather, he reflected that sometimes the greatest transformation wasn't in how a town defended itself, but in how it chose to live once it remembered its own worth. A week after Harrison's departure, Rattlesnake Junction buzzed with an energy it hadn't known in years. The morning sun caught the fresh paint on storefronts, glinted off new window glass, and illuminated the faces of people who had remembered not just their strength, but their dignity. Hamilton stood on the church steps, his Bible in hand, watching the town embrace its transformation. Walsh's smithy had become more than a workplace. It was now a school where he taught young apprentices not just ironworking, but the value of creating rather than destroying. The rhythmic ring of his hammer carried a different tune now, one of building rather than battle. "Never thought I'd see the day," Dr. Chen said, joining Hamilton on the steps. 3 new families moved in yesterday, word spreading about a town that stood up to the mining company and found a better way. "More than that," Hamilton replied. Watching Billy Chen lead a group of children past, their games now incorporating the defensive techniques they'd learned into something joyful rather than fearful. They're spreading word about a town that remembered its soul. Rebecca emerged from the general store, which now served as a community center as much as a business. The ledgers that had documented corruption had been replaced by records of cooperation, shared resources, mutual aid, plans for improvement. "Telegraph came from Cedar Ridge," she announced. "Their town council voted to stand with us against the mining company's legal challenges. Says our example gave them courage to face their own struggles." Stone and Ezra approached, their relationship transformed from one of command to genuine partnership. "Copper Valley and Silver Creek sent riders," Stone added. "They're asking about forming a regional association. Seems standing together is catching on." Hamilton watched Marcus working with a group of young men, teaching them the same defensive techniques he'd learned, but with a crucial difference. These lessons focused on protection rather than power, on community rather than control. "You know," Marcus said during a break, wiping sweat from his brow, "I used to think strength was about being feared. Now I understand it's about being trusted." The church bell rang, not in warning now, but in celebration. Walsh had repaired its mechanism, and its clear tones carried further than ever, reaching other towns with its message of renewal. Sarah Chen had established a proper medical clinic, where she trained others in both Western and Eastern healing techniques. The building that had once housed Harrison's local office had been transformed into a school. "Time for you to move on," Rebecca asked Hamilton quietly, noting how his eyes strayed to the distant horizon. "Soon," he admitted. "Roads calling, and there are other towns that might need reminding of their own strength." "You could stay," Stone offered. "Town could use a man who understands both speed and patience." Hamilton smiled gently. "That's just it. Town doesn't need me anymore. You've found your own kind of speed, your own kind of strength. Sometimes the best thing a teacher can do is recognize when the lesson's been learned." A rider approached from the direction of the territorial capital, carrying news they'd been waiting for. The mining company's attempts to dismiss Harrison as a rogue agent had failed. The evidence Rattlesnake Junction had gathered had exposed corruption throughout the organization. Other towns were coming forward with similar stories, building an irrefutable case. "Justice moves slower than a fast draw," the rider commented, "but it hits harder and lasts longer." As the sun climbed toward noon, Hamilton prepared for departure. The town gathered to bid him farewell, but there was no sadness in their goodbyes. They had learned what he came to teach, that true strength lay not in speed of draw or force of arms, but in the courage to stand together and the wisdom to build rather than destroy. "You'll be remembered here," Dr. Chen said softly, "not as Lightning Jack the gunslinger, but as the man who taught us to fight without fighting." "Remember the lesson, not the teacher," Hamilton replied. "Remember that every gift can heal or harm. It's the heart behind it that matters." Walsh presented him with a small iron cross, crafted in his forge. "To replace that brass one on your Bible," the blacksmith explained. "Something to remind you of what you helped build here." As Hamilton mounted his horse, he looked back at Rattlesnake Junction one last time. The town stood proud against the desert sky, its buildings straight and true, its people strong with a strength that went beyond physical power. Children played without fear, merchants traded without suspicion, and former enemies worked side by side toward common goals. "Your fastest draw wasn't with a gun," Rebecca observed. "It was the speed with which you drew people together, drew out their better natures." Hamilton touched the new iron cross, feeling its solid weight. "Every man has to choose what kind of mark he leaves on the world. I chose to help others find their own kind of strength." The morning breeze carried the sound of hammers and saws, of children laughing and people working together. It was the sound of a town building something guns couldn't threaten and money couldn't buy, a community founded on trust rather than fear, on creation rather than destruction. As the fastest drawer in the west rode toward the horizon, he carried with him not just memories of another town saved, but the knowledge that sometimes the greatest victory wasn't in proving your own strength, but in helping others discover theirs. The church bell rang out once more, its tones following Hamilton down the trail. But he wasn't riding toward another gunfight or confrontation. He was riding toward other towns that needed reminding of what Rattlesnake Junction had learned. That true power lay not in the speed of your draw, but in the strength of your spirit and the courage to stand together. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe, as tomorrow brings another tale of redemption, courage, and the enduring power of the human spirit. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.